Paul, thanks for starting off this conversation. I think there's actually a couple of questions you're asking, or at least are implicit in the question you're asking. I think one of the questions is how to prepare journalism students for the journalism market that they find themselves in, or will find themselves in very shortly. And the other one is, I think, is a little bit broader question, which is, what are the skills that journalism educators need to be giving or helping journalism students acquire. And I think why I split those into two things is I think we are in a pretty unique place as far as the journalism economy goes, especially in terms of newspapers. And I think television and radio are actually, radio especially is facing some challenging times, and TV is also starting to see some of its ad power eroded. So I think there's some specific business questions there, but I think the broader question are, what are the skills that journalism students need to succeed, and should they be learning necessarily newspaper specific skills? I'm a little out of my depth in that, I'm an American, and I learned at an American J school, and there are certain things that are unique to getting accreditation or a degree here, like the emphasis on shorthand that just doesn't exist in American journalism schools. So bear with me, and I'm coming at this from my own cultural context. But I think really tackling the issue of should you prepare them for newspapers? I think there is a bit of truth in the fact that good journalism is good journalism regardless of the platform. I think there are unique challenges and demands for each platform, but there are some universal skills. So developing contacts, accurate reporting, and being able to produce a story on deadline. Those are skills that all journalism students will need, whether they are in a newspaper, whether they are in a multimedia newsroom, or whether they're in traditional broadcast. So I think that there are some skills that they're going to have to walk away from school having, or at least an understanding of why they're important. Now, I think the broader question is, how do you prepare them for a fast-paced, radically changing market? I mean, is it going to be what is a job spec for what they're going to need in the next couple of years? And a few things. I mean, I think one is just to prepare students for the fact that once they get that piece of paper, once they get that diploma, that is not the end of their education. When I look at my career, I've covered everything under the sun. I've covered political campaigns. The BBC sent me to the Oscars a few times. I've covered technology, national security, international relations. And like all journalists, you have to be an expert in something for about 5 minutes. So, there's always been that element. But I think layered on top of that is just the fact that the industry is changing. And to make this out as something that journalism students are facing just now is, I mean, the industry's been changing for the last 10 or 15 years, at least ever since I've been in journalism. I've had to learn, 3 or 4 years after I got into university to get my first online job. I got it because I knew what HTML stood for, not because I knew exactly how to write a web page at the time. And, I sat there with an early version of Netscape Communicator and a book on HTML, and I basically taught myself, and that's how I did my first job. That was for a television station, even though I was trained as a print reporter. At the BBC, I, quickly learned how to do radio and television. Some of it was packaging for TV and radio. Some of it was actually shooting video. Some of it was, how do you record audio? And, these are just skills that I've had to pick up on the job. So I think what's benefited me is not the fact that I came out of school with all of those skills, but that I took the initiative to acquire the skills I needed to do the job that was at hand. And I think that's really important. And, some training, some organizations like the BBC are large enough to have their own training programs. some organizations you're just going to have to pick it up as you go along. The great thing is, I think, in the age of blogging and a lot of journalist blogging, is that you can pick up a lot of great tips from people who are sharing their knowledge and their expertise online. So you can pick up a lot of tips and network with journalists who are learning those skills as well. So, you know, I think that's one thing I think journalism students need to know. I think the other, even kind of more fundamental, slightly philosophical view is, you know, Rob Curley in the States, who's, you know, a great innovator as far as newspapers and digital journalism goes, says it's not about skill set, it's about mindset. You know, invariably these journalists are going to come out the door and they will be asked to do a job that they weren't trained to do at university. That's no problem, as long as they have an open mind about it and don't say, well, that's not my job, or, you know, I that's not journalism. You know, as long as they're open-minded to learning new skills and, you know, doing the journalism that needs doing now, not the journalism that needed doing 5 years ago, I think that's going to put them in good stead. They'll be ready for almost whatever their career throws at them. It's definitely kept me, you know, in good jobs and you know, being quite marketable in some very tough markets. I mean, the other thing I would say from my own experience is when I got out of journalism school in the mid-90s, you know, there were hiring freezes at most of the major chains because of a spike in newsprint prices. You know, there were already some pretty challenging times. Well, there were some challenging times with some advertising recession hangover from the recession in the early 90s. So, you know, there weren't a lot of jobs going. You know, I had done some politically focused work in Washington, and that gave me a black mark in a lot of people's eyes, you know, about my commitment to traditional journalism. So, you know, I can really empathize with what the market that journalism students are facing now, especially with the pressure on regional newspapers here in the UK. And all I would say is, you know, the students need to have a realistic expectation about the job that they're going to have. And look, I walked out the door thinking that I would have the job, that I would have a job that I wouldn't get for 5 or 6 years. And I think in some ways, you know, I wouldn't say it's the fault of my journalism professors. You know, they prepared me as best as they could and prepared me with a lot of great skills. But, you know, we have to be realistic about the kind of jobs you're going to get out of school. And look, I started out at an 18,000 circulation newspaper in the middle of western Kansas. It was one of the best jobs I've ever had. You know, I served a lot of rural communities. I was their only source of news. And they, you know, were very appreciative about it and even told me so to my face. It was great. So I think, you know, one thing that I would say is there's no place that's too small to start off at. And a lot of the key lessons that I learned about journalism, I learned from my first editor, and I learned from that first job. And, you know, the .com boom of the late 90s allowed me to, within 5 years after I'd left university, join the Washington Bureau of the BBC. So, you know, where you start doesn't necessarily dictate where you're going to end up. And as long as you, like I said, have an open mind and that, you know, can-do mindset, and that idea that you will find the skills that you need to do your job, then I think journalism students will be in good stead. And if you can instill some of those, you know, lifelong learning and that open-minded mindset into your students, you're going to be doing both journalism and your students a great service. Thanks for the conversation, Paul, and I look forward to some of the other contributions.